very surprising. So I went up in almost kind of a congressional setting. I feel like I'm in the Capitol building standing before the Congress of the United States here. So I'm going to give you some Catholic point of view, not to proselytize you, but just so that you have kind of a sense of the optic I'm coming from. I know this class ends at 3:20, and I want to give ample time for your questions. So is there a break, or does it just go from 2 to 3?
Plowing straight through. No break.
And then when we get into the questions, please be aware there isn't anything that either I would personally, I think, find off-putting, or you think it's a dumb question, or you don't have to agree with everything I'm going to say today. Again, this is a truth. This isn't a fact. Now, I can share with you, Linda can as well, the experiences that we've had that aren't just true. They are true, but they're also factual in that we've experienced them. But on the other hand, I'm not here in any which way to convince you. And I do that no matter what kind of a group I'm addressing. So to begin with, for Christians at least, we would teach that Satan has been defeated. Now that's assuming that people believe there's a Satan. We can talk about that at some point too. But we would teach that Satan has been defeated. The reason for that point of view, that truth, is because of the place and value and the centrality of the cross in Christianity. For the Bible provides, to some degree, a chronicled experience through the lenses of a whole variety of people, Jews, Israelites, and others, and Gentiles too, of how they understood God, that eventually, in a sense, became an embrace of Judaism and then later Christianity. So, the first book of the Bible is Genesis. And in the first book of the Bible, it's the story not only of creation, but it's the story of humanity's fall, what we would say, fall from grace. In other words, the beginning of the estrangement between the human race and God, the Creator. And that all happens with the metaphor of the apple, not the apple, but the fruit of the tree, and the tree of knowledge, and the tree of good and evil, and God putting boundaries around those trees as opposed to everything else in the garden. Now, from the Catholic point of view, we teach that every book of the Bible is inspired. What that means is that every book of the Bible contains truth. Fundamentalist Christians, and those who would be considered kind of in the realm of the evangelical, Pentecostal, etc., their point of view would be what makes the Bible inspired is that every word is true. Catholic theology would say every book contains truth. So, for example, that's why Catholicism, and I'm not here to criticize other dimensions of Christianity, that's why in a lot of respects Catholicism and science are very compatible. In fact, in the Vatican, they have a whole arena of scientific study that goes on, a whole academy of science that goes on. So we would say that the whole Adam and Eve story and the story of creation was more of an allegory, which was a way of presenting a story that told the truth, rather than the world was created in 7 days. So the first book of the Bible, how you guys? That's all right. The first book of the Bible, Genesis, we have the seduction by Adam and Eve by the serpent. And the serpent is assumed to be Satan, although you'll never find anywhere in the Old Testament the name Satan. You'll have a lot of examples in the book of Isaiah, the book of Deuteronomy in particular, certainly in Exodus when the Israelites built the golden calf. That was certainly an experience of idolatry. You'll have a lot of citations about evil and about different kinds of idolatry that the Israelites and then later the Jews practiced, but you'll not have a specific proper name of evil. The name Satan doesn't show up until the Gospels. And that's where there's a real power in the name. And it goes not only to baptism, and I would think that would be regardless of what denomination, and it would also apply to the ministry that both Linda and I are involved in. So at baptism and the Catholic tradition, I've never been to a baptism in, say, the Episcopal tradition or mainline Christian tradition or even fundamentalist, say a Bible church. The first question that's asked in our tradition, we have infant baptism, but we also baptize others. In the rite of baptism, the first question that is asked by the deacon, priest, or bishop is, "What's your name?" And the reason for that is not to say, "Geez, I forgot your name. Tell me it again, please." It's because there's a link between the call of the name and the call into a lifestyle with Christ. And that's because in the Old Testament, the prophets were called by name, the patriarchs were called by name, Jesus called the disciples by name. In that same kind of way, in our tradition at least, learning the name of the demon is very important because it's in the learning of the name of the demon that the power of the demon begins to be reduced. And that's in an adverse way that everything you may think about in terms of God. If you think about God, whether or not you believe there's a God, that's your private, personal decision. But if you think about everything that God represents, Satan would represent the absolute opposite. So, for example, the demons don't want to divulge their name. Because to divulge their name would mean that they would have to enter into the realm of the light and be exposed. The same way that a person, what is your name? Well, my name is such and such. What are you asking of God's church? Well, to become a child of God or to be baptized in the faith community, or whatever answer they give. They then begin a walk into the realm of the light of Christ. Conversely, demons don't want any of it. Because their whole reality is an absolute reversal of God. So, the first book of the Bible, you have the serpent. The last book of the Bible, you have Satan now manifesting as a raging dragon. And in between, you have certain books, and certainly in the New Testament, when Satan is much more identified, you have the saga of how God and the human race try and manage a relationship that is very mercurial. Sometimes it's very intense, sometimes it's very estranged. Some of the books are much more explicit. Not every one of the books of the Bible would necessarily be explicit about the estrangement or the intimacy between God and human beings. But certainly there's enough of the books that are. I set that really as a kind of a context because the whole issue of Satan in the world now is that if we teach that Satan has been defeated through the cross of Christ, then why is this reality still present? Satan is still present because it's for God's greater glory. God does not interfere in free will. And so God gives us opportunities to decide and to choose. God gives Satan boundaries. And so Satan can only operate through the will of God. Satan wasn't created by God to be Satan. Satan was God's most powerful angel. And certainly, I think regardless of whether you're Catholic or not Catholic, it really doesn't matter about what I'm about to say. We used to be much more as a church act-centered with regards to sin. When the Vatican Council took place in the early 1960s, and the church went through, in a sense, kind of a redefinition of some of how we understood ourselves, we went from an act-centered church in terms of sin to much more of a broader pattern of behavior in terms of sin. Now, that's not to say that we don't teach their sin, that there isn't personal sin. But the manner in which, for example, we celebrate in our tradition, we have what's called confession, or we have what's called the sacrament of reconciliation. And when I was a child, and I'm 58 years old now, when I was a child and I was preparing to make my first confession and then go to confession as a kid, there was much more of a stress on remembering all your sins. When the council took place and all the 7 sacramental rituals were revised, we went to a shift away from an act-centered, sort of legalistic experience to much more of a conversion, a change of heart, a compassion of God, a merciful God, and much more a sense of a pattern of one's life. And so that had a huge bearing on where does Satan have a place. Think for a minute yourself. When you've done certain things in your family, like traditions, and eventually those traditions may, for whatever reason, kind of stop, it's very easy to forget, it's very easy to remember that those traditions were once a part of who your family was. Whether it's how you celebrated a birthday, or wherever you went on Christmas Eve, or Christmas Day, or some other kind of special family event. Or if there were certain kinds of rituals and traditions you did, and then they stopped for some reason. Well, eventually what happens is we forget about it. That's, in a sense, I think, and again, this is much more opinion than it is anything that I really read, the notion of Satan being part of the landscape of salvation went away. Because as our understanding of sin changed, our understanding of Satan changed. Because our understanding of morality was looked at a little differently. It isn't like the faith of the church changed. It's how we expressed it and how we kind of looked at our behavior, which I think has a lot to do with anthropology and culture, how we looked at what we are and who we are in a very different kind of way. So Satan, for Catholics, kind of like I've had people call me. I get a lot of calls because of the book and the movie. And a lot of people who call me from around the country will say, have you talked to your local diocese? A diocese, for those of you who don't know, is a church territory. It's like a parish. Like Sacred Heart Parish has certain boundaries. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're not in the boundaries of my parish, you can't come there. There's not like a wall. You have to show a membership card. But it's an ecclesia. A diocese is like our Diocese of San Jose is Santa Clara County. It's one county, and most dioceses, at least in the Catholic system, are by counties. Now, some are multiple counties, but it's usually by county. So a lot of times I'll get calls from people and I'll say, well, have you talked to your local priest? Well, sometimes their answer is that we don't do those things anymore, exorcism. Or they'll call the local bishop. Our bishop doesn't believe in that. And so there is no bishop ordained now as a bishop who isn't a product of the post-Vatican II church. In other words, there isn't a bishop who was ordained a priest, really, for all intents and purposes, before 1964. So there would be, because you're usually at 75, bishops have to retire. Some retire sooner. So all the bishops now who are ordained are all ordained out of the system of seminary education, like me, where this kind of topic really got almost no attention whatsoever. And so even for Catholics, there is kind of like, oh, who is this Satan? What do we do about Satan? Do we believe in Satan? And if the church is asking us to, why? And a lot of times people scratch their heads. But Satan's never gone away. Satan's greatest deceit is to convince us he doesn't exist. Because then, if we believe he doesn't exist, then we come up with different answers as to why certain things happen. And it also, I think, has had a big effect, and I can talk about this, either myself or your questions may bring this up, in the manner in which people go to look for truth. What hasn't changed is that human beings, all of us, human beings always are looking for answers to questions. I just celebrated a funeral mass in my church this morning for a 43-year-old guy who died he was been sick for quite a while, and basically several of his organs just crapped out. And he died. And so, what I do at funeral masses is it takes a leap of faith to believe there's such a thing as eternal life. I can't prove it. I can show you in the scriptures where we talk about it. I can certainly make reference to the fact that the apostles saw the risen Jesus. But again, those are 2,000-year-old texts. They were eyewitnesses. And at a certain point, you either believe those texts are true, or you say, well, maybe they're true, maybe they're not true. I'm not really sure. And so in that same kind of way, the whole notion of Satan never went away. But as people got out of the habit, and the church got out of the habit really of talking about Satan, it kind of went off the charts. So the role that Satan plays in the story of salvation starts at the first book of the Bible. It doesn't end at the last book of the Bible, but in a sense, those two books, which are the first and the last book of the Bible, provide the bookends to really understand the clash and the battle between good and evil that we would teach came to a culminated moment, an event on the cross. We call that Good Friday, that comes up 2 days before Easter. That therefore, when we as Christians at least talk about Satan, it's talking about Satan in a fashion that God has already won. It's not like we talk about Satan, at least in our tradition, where it's like two boxers who are sort of equal going at it in the arena. Because we're not comparing two apples. It's apples and oranges. God is divine. Satan is in the realm we call preternatural, which is the realm between supernatural and natural, the realm of the angels. And so therefore, every time, for example, we celebrate a baptism, there is a prayer. It's not a major exorcism prayer. It's what we call a minor exorcism prayer, because it's not a direct address to Satan. It's more of a direct address to the condition of evil. Satan is acknowledged. And then the parents are asked to repronounce their baptismal promises, which are a rejection of Satan and sin and embrace of God in terms of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That kind of reminder is a very good example about we ourselves, though I don't think we consciously always make the connections, we ourselves, at least implicitly, are reminded that Christ is the victor. But in the same breath, until Christ returns for the second and last time, Satan will be allowed to function at some level. In 2004, the late Pope, John Paul II, issued a mandate through the Vatican department. They're called congregations. And it was through what was called the department or the congregation of the doctrine of the faith that our current Pope was the head of, Joseph Ratzinger, who's now Benedict. In 2000, and the mandate was that every diocese, every bishop should select and train an exorcist. Reason for that was because the amount of occult activity in Western Europe was reaching very severe epidemic proportions. And so in 2005, after bishop of this diocese, our current bishop, Bishop McGraw, was beginning to get more than a rare call, but beginning to get a lot of calls for people to investigate alleged satanic and other kinds of spiritual experiences decide to appoint an exorcist, I wasn't the first choice. The first priest he approached politely said no. He was one of my best friends. And so when he told me this, I very naively said, I could do that. I could be the exorcist. I believe in the personification of evil. I think I can fulfill that ministry, not knowing what it was going to be. So I was getting ready. I was at St. Nicholas Parish in Los Altos. I was there 15 years, 12 as pastor. And in our diocese, we have terms. So you're assigned for 6, and at the end of 6, it's renewable. But in that second 6-year window, it's possible that the bishop might move you somewhere to another church or other ministry or experience of ministry in this diocese. So my 12 years were coming to a close, and I'm a very proactive person. I didn't want to wait until he said, okay, it's time to move. And I really felt I needed a break. It had been 22 years as a priest. So I was getting ready to go to Rome anyway on a sabbatical. So he appointed me, and he said, oh, by the way, there's a course you can take there. Well, it was very apparent after 4 or 5 sessions in the course at this particular seminary and not too far from the Vatican that I really felt I needed like a tutorial or an apprenticeship. And there were 2 other Americans in the course. One was the writer, the author of the book, Matt Baglio, whom I never knew and never met before. And the other was a Franciscan priest who unfortunately died about 2 years ago of Lou Gehrig's disease. And that other priest, the Franciscan priest, was working at a church, a very prominent basilica. It's actually called St. John Lateran, if any of you have ever been to Rome. He was working at St. John Lateran, kind of apprenticing under an 85-year-old priest in a chapel, although the chapel is probably about the size of Saginaw Parish in terms of the church, called the Scala Santa, which means holy stairs. And in that chapel are the stairs that St. Helen had brought back from Jerusalem, that allegedly were the stairs that Jesus walked up when he faced Pontius Pilate. So this priest would come on Thursday mornings and he would relay all these various fascinating experiences. And the more I listened, the more I thought, well, I'm clueless. I don't have a clue. How am I going to function in this role if I have to go home? When I have to go home, and if I get inquiries. So I found an exorcist. Long story, make it very short. I was able to locate, there's 9 exorcists in Rome. And I was studying Italian. And Carmen, God bless him, knew very little English. I knew more Italian than he knew English, but we made it work. And I worked for him for 3.5 months, 3 days a week, at the church of St. Lawrence outside the walls. And I would go out there, and I would sit with him, pray with the people he was exorcising, and just observe. And then I would go home and I would journal. What did I see today that I hadn't seen before? And then every few weeks I would sit down with him and a translator, because I knew a lot of conversational Italian, but I didn't know really technical Italian. And I would just throw questions at him to understand, why did he do this with this reaction, and what does this reaction mean in relationship to the whole? And that's how really I learned how to minister in this manner. Most of the people who come to me, and I would say probably in 6+ years, I've seen well over 100 now who come to me. The vast majority have issues of mental health. Now, I don't do this ministry by myself. In fact, Linda Holtz is on my team, and she's a discerner. And she can explain that in a little bit too if she so chooses to. I have a medical doctor, a clinical psychologist, and a psychiatrist. They're all practicing Catholics. They all believe in the possibility of satanic existence. But we don't look at when someone comes in. First of all, they don't all come in and we operate as a team all at once. I will use them as consultants, and I will do referrals after I've done sort of the initial discernment and assessment. But we all are open to the reality that Satan exists, but that doesn't mean that every time someone comes in, when I get lots of calls that begin like this, Father, I need an exorcism. And my pat answer back is, I don't do them on demand. It doesn't work that way. It's not like you step on a rusty nail, you get out of the local ER, you get a tetanus shot, everything's fine. It doesn't work that way. And a lot of people think it does. So, and I always follow that up by saying, I'm not being sarcastic, but it's a process, and there's a protocol. And there needs to be both. I'm not obviously a psychiatrist or psychologist or a medical doctor. And so we have to rule out the natural before we can go to the preternatural. And sometimes that's very difficult. Sometimes there are lots of signs and manifestations that one may say one thing and one may say another thing depending on what they are. And you need a multiplicity of eyes and ears and brains that are considering each of these situations, because each situation is very unique. There's not a lot there are some similarities, but every single person who comes, their background is different. Sometimes all the manifestations are not there. They don't all have to be there in order for me then to make a declaration that this is a demonic or some other attachment. So every situation is different, and it's very dangerous. If I have to be, and this is in the foreword of the solemn rite of exorcism, it's very clear, we take a very conservative approach. You have to involve other experts. You have to do serious discernment. And for an exorcist, and there were two little antiphons that I learned when I took the course in Rome, which was all taught in Italian. I had to have a translator every week. The exorcist is the ultimate skeptic, and the last thing an exorcist does is an exorcism. So you try different approaches. You always start with the lowest common denominator. So, for example, when people come in, I ask them very sensitive questions. I mean, it may not be confessional, but I ask lots of very, very tender, and I very make sure that I really say, I want to reverence the questions I'm going to ask you and the answers you're going to give me back, because sometimes they're very pointed, and they can be intrusive in a way, but in order for me to be able to give the best answer and to really know what direction to go in, we have to ask a lot of very personal questions. And so the last thing I want to do is to do something that's going to do more harm than good. You always start with the lowest common denominator. So you ask a question. Not everybody who comes to me is a Catholic. Satan isn't kind of a Catholic deal. He's a human deal. I think because our church has an emphasis on that, certainly there is more of an identity, and certainly when you go to the movies, it tends to be, but not always, usually people of religion, and more often than not, there's usually a Catholic nuance somehow. So I've spent time with people who are Christian and non-Catholic. I've spent time with people who are non-Christian, with Jewish people, Hindus, Buddhists, agnostics, even Catholics who claim to be atheists. So it isn't just, someone calls me, they don't have to be, you have to be in this diocese. That's one thing you have to be. Now, I have, on occasion, said yes to seeing people from outside Santa Clara County, although I don't like doing that, but oftentimes people are just desperate, and there's nobody to help them. Think about this for yourselves. If someone came up to you and started saying to you that they were seeing demons or hearing the voices of what they thought were demons, you don't have to answer this. Think about what your initial reaction would be. Now, think about that in light of if someone came to you and A, we don't oftentimes have a language to know how to respond. B, the thought of Satan, demons, or any of these other kinds of celestial matters may really scare the bejeebers out of us. Or C, this is just really weird and I don't want to deal with it. Think about that in terms of the polarity of how many people experience isolation, because very often when these topics come up, and if they're not able to even talk to the right family members or friends, they can be really put off in a corner. So there have been people I have seen from outside the diocese, because even there's only 52 exorcists in the United States, Catholic exorcists, that I'm personally aware of. There may be a few others, but every diocese does not have one. And if the diocese doesn't have one and you call the local bishop and there's not an apparatus to even respond, either with the intelligent questions to ask or the appropriate referrals, you can end up kind of going from person to person to person and finding yourself incredibly frustrated and afraid and fearful. And, when you get very isolated, you can oftentimes not be very rational. So in that regard, I have seen people, I have seen occasionally people from outside the diocese where they're just desperate. So there's a whole array of questions that I ask first go around. And then some of those questions would involve, their own personal habits, their own lifestyle, their experience growing up, people they associate with, issues having to do with addictions, being a victim of sexual abuse. 80% of the people who come to me have been sexually abused by a parent, a sibling, a neighbor, friends' parents. Sexual abuse is a doorway for a demon. That does not mean that anybody who's been abused, here comes a demon. But it's a soul wound. And so demons are always looking for people with broken relationships or no relationships. Where it becomes kind of a perfect storm is if the person's been involved in the occult and they're abuse victims. That kind of has been very often a combination that I've encountered. But I'm not at all saying, and I want to be very careful and clear what I'm saying, a person who's been abused, particularly sexually, that does not automatically make them a candidate for something in the diabolical realm. This is fundamentally a healing ministry. In the Catholic tradition, we have what's called the sacraments. And the sacraments there's 7 of them. And we celebrate them. Some of them we celebrate them at specific times in our life. Some of them we celebrate on a regular basis like Mass, Sunday Mass. 3 of them have to do with initiation. In other words, our bond to the church. Baptism, Eucharist, confirmation. Several of them have to do with lifestyle, such as marriage or priesthood. The other 2 are sacraments of healing, confession, reconciliation, which is a healing of the heart, healing of relationships. The other healing sacrament is the sacrament of the sick, which we used to call, in the old days of the church, we call it the last rites. Sometimes movies will kind of, if there is some Catholic theme and there's a priest or something and there involves the last, they won't say the sacrament of the sick, they'll say the last rites. But the sacrament of the sick is not just for people who are dying. It used to be. We went back to more of an original understanding of it with the Vatican Council that I mentioned earlier. Now, exorcism is not a sacrament. Sacraments, because sacraments, the byproduct of the sacraments is that they deepen our relationship with God. We say they give us grace. They give us God's relationship. Exorcism is a sacramental, which means it's a way of expressing or serving as a pointer to the divine, but doesn't give the benefit of God's relationship in the same way that a sacrament does. And so the ministry, however, is really a healing ministry. It's a healing of heart. Sometimes it's a healing of body. It's a healing of soul. And I stress that no matter what group I say that to, because I think very often the movies, particularly the first movie about exorcism going back to 1973, that still, in my experience at least, that still is the national icon when this topic comes up. The Linda Blair movie, with the spinning heads and the green pea soup. In fact, in the movie, The Rite, Anthony Hopkins kind of stole a line that was mine. I didn't have a part in the movie. But there's a part in the movie when he says to my character, "What do you think this is all about, spinning heads and green pea soup?" Well, I had that conversation with him about half an hour before he went on the set to actually play that particular scene out. But there are some very dramatic things that happen that you would see in a movie. There is, oftentimes, the person has inordinate strength. Sometimes a person speaks in a language they have no competency in. Sometimes there is a foaming at the mouth, but it isn't a foaming at the mouth like a dog, but there is a foaming at the mouth that's related to a kind of experience of having to do with deliverance, when people are coughing in a very inhuman kind of way that is dramatically different than if you and I had a common cold or we had bronchitis or something. It just goes on and on and on, and it's related to the power of prayer that's happening while the deliverance is taking place. Sometimes there is an aversion to the sacred that can be very dramatic, where the person can't look at a crucifix, or they can't bless themselves with holy water without feeling a sense of burning, or they can't take the communion into themselves because it will cause incredible discomfort. So that's not to say that everything in the movies, whether it's my movie or whether it's at least the original movie, I mean, there's others that have been made, but it is to say that there is a point where kind of the reality ends and Hollywood takes over. If you have any questions about that, at some point you can ask if you wish. So I think because of the cinema effect, we have this very macabre notion that exorcism is very hocus pocus, when really it's really a ritual. Now people ask me, well, can you define it for me? It's really a ritual of the church, an authoritative ritual of the church that calls upon Christ in union with the communion of saints and the angels to expel or deliver a person from the diabolical. It's an authoritative ritual. And it's been an authoritative ritual since 1614. The reason, this was asked me by some media guy a while back, well, what do you think, what do you think the genesis of the ritual was? Usually rituals become authoritative because there's been some kind of abuse from the past. So I'm assuming. I don't know the history of how we eventually got to the form of ritual. But I can say usually you have them because in order to kind of chronicle some kind of standardized practice, it's usually been because there's been abuses from the past. So certainly in the time of Jesus, he exorcised the demons. He had two main roles in his job description. He taught and he healed. And some of those miracles are stories of exorcisms. That wasn't all he did, but he certainly did that a fair amount. After he died and ascended, the church certainly had a much more informal kind of ritual where people would gather and they would simply invoke the name of Christ. And they would lay hands, just like we do today. And they would use oil at times, if necessary, to be able to try and expel the demon. So, most of the time, the ministry involves things that you would not find at all glamorous, that would never make it to the movie set. Because the difficulty of this work very often is discerning what is the root cause of what the person's suffering from. So when people come, I never assume anything. They come in and say, I think I have something demonic. I'm not there to say, well, okay, let me get my Ghostbuster equipment on and we'll go at it. I don't assume that. I go in with a completely open mind. So and I always make it very clear. I'm not here to debunk you, and I'm not here to in any way disrespect you. And I assume everything you're telling me is what you're experiencing. I have no reason not to. But the root cause may not end up being what the people themselves believe it to be. There have been times when people have said to me, I've been having this problem or this problem, and this friend of mine says I'm possessed. Or I lose my temper and I go into rages, and my family really thinks that there's a demon. And that's what they then believe. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes in one session, said, why don't you go, are you in therapy? Well, yes, I've been under the care of a psychiatrist for 5 years and I'm on meds. So obviously I'm taking that into account, but sometimes it's making people realize that what they think is wrong isn't the real reason for what's wrong. It's helping them then find it. And I think as a church, whether they have something demonically wrong or not, to me, that's not the primary reason for this ministry. It's really to help people in the healing process. It really, truly is. And there's very few of us that really even have a language to understand a lot of this. And I have to say, when I was in the seminary, we're trying to get this changed now in the seminary system so that our priests that are coming out will have at least the basic tools to ask some of the, what I would call the rudimentary questions. And as what I've told the priests in our diocese is, for God's sake, if somebody calls you and mentions the word Satan or demon, don't hang up the phone on them. Or don't say go away. Or don't call them and say they're crazy. Listen to their story. As you can always refer them to me, but at least listen to their story. Because very often they've already been shut off about my faith. And they don't need more of that. So, I think of our church as Christ as the center, and we make all these posturing statements about Christ and our relationship with Christ, and we have to back it up. And when people come and they're hurting, I do think we have a real responsibility to do all that we can to help them, whatever it is, through the root cause. So as I said earlier, most of the people I see have issues of mental health. Occasionally the mental health issues and the demonic issues are running side by side, but not always. And as I said earlier, it can be a very dangerous ministry. And every person who comes, we treat them with great reverence. We have a team approach. I certainly see some people on a regular basis to pray with them. Sometimes people have really not so much issues that there is something demonically attached as they need prayers to help heal. And I can do that as well. So I think at this point I would like to stop. I realize we go to 3:30, and I've been speaking for about 35 minutes, so I want to open this up for questions. Yes. I thought you had your hand up. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so...
what's your name?
Oh, Sean.
Hi, Sean.
Hi. In your book, we were reading your book. In your book, you said that, and in your lecture earlier, you said that the devil doesn't want to be discovered. That his greatest deceit is that he doesn't exist. So, that just kind of made me wonder, if that's the case, then what's the point of possession in the first place? I mean, if he would be better off, as far as I know, possessing someone would only confirm the idea that he doesn't exist. Not only to that person, but to the people that obviously that person talks to. Yeah, I was possessed. So
Satan's goal. There's two answers to your question. And you bring up a good point. Then what's the point of Satan? Satan's already lost. So why is he still? What's the point of him being here? To take as many of the children of God with him to hell as possible. That's his goal. Because the reason that Satan is Satan, which is very important you know this, because I don't even think very often our Catholics know this. When God became incarnate, in other words, when God took on our human flesh, he didn't give up his divinity. And Jesus is not a guy who is called God. He is all God and all human. When the Father sends the Son to lower himself below the nature of the angels, the idea that the angels would have to pay homage to a divinity who also had a humanity created such a rage of pride and jealousy. That's what caused rebellion in heaven. And so Satan has an intensely hatred of the human race. So he will do all that he can, knowing that he's already lost. He will do all that he can to dissuade any of God's children from being his father.
But wouldn't possessing someone simply reaffirm their belief in God, though?
Yes, it should. It should, but it doesn't always. Because first of all, you're assuming that a person who recognizes some kind of demonic attachment, and I'll talk about possession as opposed to these other things, you're assuming that the person themselves believes they're possessed. We live, and you guys all know this by far better than me. I mean, our kids are learning how to run the computer at 2 and 3 years of age. We live in a very highly scientific, technological age. And for many people, if you cannot see it, measure it, it doesn't exist. Most therapists, for example, this is not to knock therapists, because there are some very fine ones. Most therapists are atheists or agnostics. That's why I won't only use a Catholic therapist. Because I want the people I'm sending them to. That's true if I had somebody from my parish with a marriage problem. I wouldn't just say, pick up the phone book and pick out somebody. I can remember this quick little aside when I was ordained many years ago, with tons of weddings in my first parish. And this couple was having huge problems, and they went to therapy. They'd only been married a few months, and they were having problems even when I did the wedding, but they kept assuring me they're working on these issues, and they're very committed. So they go to this therapist, and the therapist says to them, first marriages are trial marriages. I said, get away from that man. He's a quack. First marriages are trial marriages. So if I'm going to send him to a professional social scientist, I want to send him to somebody who's got a faith component to their ministry of healing. Because therapists are in the business of healing. Psychiatrists and psychologists, they are, I think. Especially if you go to somebody who's really good. And it's not about, being a proselytizer or it's all about God, but we're all spiritual beings. Regardless of our denomination or lack thereof. We are. Because we have a soul. That's what makes us a spiritual being. And so, and I say this at funerals all the time, we all ask the question at a certain point in our life, why am I here? What am I doing here? And what happens to me when I die? We all ask that. And people have been asking that since the time when human beings got reason. Why? Because we know that everything in the realm has a point of origin, except God. For those who believe in God. That everything has a point of origin. And so that's one of the reasons why you've had more and more people that have been drawn into the occult or to other kinds of New Agey practices, because oftentimes people don't find satisfaction in classical traditional prayer or classical traditional spirituality, and because very often it doesn't give the answers they want in the time frame they want, which is we live in a very immediate age. So to go back to what you were saying, make this long answer to your short question. There's a presumption that people recognize as something demonic, and very often they don't. Very often by the time the person's come to me, they've had a history of depression, or they've had a history of psychosis, or they've had a history of what's been diagnosed as bipolar or schizophrenia or all kinds of things before they ever come to me, because everything they've tried doesn't work, or it hasn't helped. And therefore then they kind of sometimes are led to conclude, well, maybe this is something outside of what's natural. And so therefore lots of times they'll come to me, and so they wouldn't necessarily have a reaction or a response that would indicate to them this is demonic. Because most people aren't educated to know that. Before I got in this ministry 6 years ago, I probably would have been kind of in that same group too. So there's a lot that's involved, and people don't recognize possession very often on their own. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
I hope I didn't need to be so loquacious. Okay, go ahead.
So has anyone ever disregarded your diagnosis about a possession and they've either looked elsewhere for exorcism or tried on their own?
Yes, that's a very good question. In fact, we had one of those situations recently. We get into that. Go ahead.
Did you all hear the question?
Oh, sorry.
No.
Can you repeat it and speak up?
Yeah, so has anyone disregarded your diagnosis about the possession and looked elsewhere or tried it on their own?
Yes. Has anyone ever disagreed with my diagnostic and looked elsewhere? The answer is yes.
How often does that happen?
Well, I wouldn't say too often, but my goal is, how do we help heal this person? So I don't have any pride. If you want to try another approach, I've had people who I have exercised, and they've grown weary, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. And sometimes have said, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going elsewhere. This isn't working. And I've said, okay, I hope that good luck. So I don't like say, don't let the door hit you in the butt on your way out kind of thing. It's not about me, Gary Thomas. It's about, hey, how do you help? How do you get healed? So, do I regret they leave? Yes, but I don't do anything that's adverse toward them or disrespectful toward them. But I've exercised, I guess now about a dozen people in 6 years. And I'm getting more people now I'm exercising, actually. The 2 people I initially am thinking of who kind of bailed out, they just didn't want to continue to enjoy it. This is difficult. It's very stressful. An exorcism can take anywhere from 45 minutes to a couple hours, depending on the intensity of the experience and whether or not we've been able to deliver the demon. And it also has something to do with me and the team and how much energy the person we're exercising has too. Because when you're done, you're kind of like fried for a while. So yes, I have had people sometimes.
Then a quick follow-up question. Since you said you're in the thing of healing, do you ever call like social services or any other social groups like that when you hear cases of abuse or addiction?
That's a very good question. The question is, do I call people? Do I call the Child Protective Services?
Yeah, or social services.
Sure.
Anything you hear about cases of abuse or addiction.
The answer to your question is, I've never been in a position to have had to do that.
So if all the cases are,
Yes. Yes. Or the person is now in their 40s or 50s.
And it's already been more time to happen.
Yes. But in our diocese, for example, and this is true of every Catholic diocese in the United States since the abuse scandal of the year 2001, every diocese has an office for the protection of children and vulnerable adults.
So you could call someone like that without having to go out.
Yes, and I have done that at times to make sure I know what I'm doing. Okay. But that's a good question. Yes.
Sorry, my question might.
Sorry.
What would happen to a person if they were theoretically possessed and they never sought treatment?
What would happen to a person if they were theoretically possessed and never sought treatment? They would suffer. There are people, I'm sure, who have some level of possession. When we use the word possession, the definition, at least in this topic, will be where a demon fully controls the body of a human being. Demons cannot control souls. Souls are made in the image and likeness of God. They can control bodies. Most of the people who come to me are not possessed. They have a demonic attachment, or what we would call a partial possession, as opposed to a full possession. The word integration means where a person has accepted the demon. But most of the people who come to me are usually, they've just kind of crossed the line where they realize they're over their head and they're in trouble. Or they've tried a whole bunch of different approaches to get better and they haven't, and they seek me out. So I've had maybe a couple of full possessions, but it's the exception. So the answer to the question is, if someone doesn't seek out help, they can go their whole life, or however long if it is demonic, they can go their whole life till death if they don't get help. See, which leads me to say something else that's very important for you to know. Very often, a parent will call, or a brother will call, or a sibling will call, and say, my brother, my son, my child, whatever, has been acting in a very bizarre way, and we're not sure if there's something demonic, but they've been in therapy forever, and would you be willing to see them? And if they're local, I will say, how open is this person to get help? Oh, no, they don't want to come and see me. And then my answer is, then it won't do any good. Because God doesn't interfere in free will. So if the person is coming, and they're really coming forcibly, and they're coming against their will, the efficaciousness of the prayers, the power of the prayers will work, if that's what it is. So sometimes people can go their whole life from the time there maybe has been a demonic attachment.
So, I guess my next question is, if somebody dies while they're, can you die because of possession?
Yes, you can. Linda might want to chime in on this. Can you die because of a possession?
Sometimes the demon can be so possessive that it forces a person to kill themselves. So, yes, they can be possessed enough that a demon overrides them. They can commit suicide. They can actually, we have special prayers that keeps the person from, sometimes they'll just start choking. And you have to, on this prayers, and they'll say release. The demon has to release the person's breathing. And as soon as Father says in the name of Lord Jesus Christ, the person goes, oh, they can breathe again. But if he doesn't know enough to say that, then the person can actually die very easily if you have something that's enough of the prayers. Have you ever had somebody die?
Have I ever had someone die? The closest that I could say, there was a woman. She was Vietnamese. She claimed that she had a demonic attachment. She was under the care of a psychiatrist at Stanford who was an atheist and didn't believe in any of this. I was in my early years as an exorcist, maybe my first year, and we were still in the discernment process, but she was on meds. The therapist thought that she was suffering from a kind of schizophrenia. I consulted several other exorcists. I went to her home because she had claimed that there were certain things that had happened in her home, so I went and I exorcised the house. The ritual to exorcise a house is much more abridged than an exorcism of a person. But she took her own life. And the day before she took her own life, she came to see me with her husband, told me she was going to do it. And I tried to convince her that would be an incredibly selfish act and it would forever affect her family. But the day after I saw her, she took her life. So, after consulting a number of the other exorcists, and after the suicide was over, when I'm talking to people halfway across the country, they're not observing anything. See, there were no manifestations when I would pray with her. There were no manifestations. And that's what was so difficult to discern. And so I would just pray deliverance prayer. And she was under the care of a psychiatrist, and they did take her threats very seriously. But I would say that's the only person that I've ever been associated with in this kind of context where the person died. Kind of died.
She said that she was going to take her own life. How come you didn't want to?
Her husband already had done that. He had done that several times already. And the therapist knew about it as well. Yes, that's fine.
I had a question about free will. Loudly, please, Jesse. Got a question about free will.
Questions about free will.
Essentially, so when God gave angels the power for free will, Satan cast away the love of God, and big battle, lost it, right? But the demons and their names, are the demons also like angels that followed Satan?
I'm not walking with you. Are the demons? Are the
I was wondering, are the demons also angels that fought with Satan? Is that how they?
Yes, the demons are angels who were in the angelic choirs, who rebelled, who were part of the rebellion in heaven.
So, and they also have their own free will as well.
That is correct.
So,
but the free will of an angel is far clearer than the free will of a human being. Yeah. So that's why in the scriptures it says the demons cannot be forgiven, because their clarity is such that they know God in a very different way than we do.
Yeah. So, do they take orders from Satan, or are they wanting to do this just on their own?
No, they take orders from Satan because there's a hierarchy, and I want you to chime in on this. There's a hierarchy of angels, dominions, principalities, thrones, powers, cherubim, seraphim, angels and archangels. They're in a hierarchy, so the angels are not all equal. Neither are the demons. So when you have a demonic issue, there's never just one demon. There are a gang of them. And the ones that are the easiest to deliver are the ones that are the weaker. And in the same way that the angels would always be in a focus on the glory of God, the demons would be in a rage, in the antithetical kind of way, very different than the angelic choirs. They would be in a rage even against themselves. You want to add anything?
Yeah, we know that at least 1/3 of all the angels at the time fell with Satan. They made that free will choice to fall. So you have 1/3, which is a massive amount of numbers. But just as like we talk about dominion, you take the opposite side. We have a demon that his name would be Azazel, and Azazel he's a legion. That means he has 10,000 demons in one name. So very, very powerful. We'll meet some very insignificant, but we meet some of those possessed people. I mean, that when Azazel shows up, that person has absolutely no control of the body.
So I haven't talked to you. Not that I don't want to talk to you. Go ahead. I'll try and get everybody.
It's more of a two-part question, but I guess how does the occult leave someone vulnerable to possession? And usually the common, I guess, connotation with occult is some sort of diabolical practice or invoking something from that realm, instead of rather the original meaning had something to do with a hidden practice or something that may not be known to all. So does it have anything to do with one's intent in completing ritual, or is it the fact that most of those practices are for selfish reasons, or I guess exclude God's role in one's life, or how does that affect someone's?
The occult and the satanic are not one and the same. The occult is a doorway to Satan. It's not the same thing as necessarily being satanic, but it's idolatry and it's paganism and it's against the first commandment. And so what happens is in the occult, where there are a lot of it's knowledge of hidden things, which is one of the signs of a demonic attachment, what oftentimes happens is when people are invoking realities or spirits in the spirit realm, they don't always know who they're getting. That's one thing. And so when, like Wicca, or even certain kinds of holistic kinds of meditation, such as Reiki, yoga as an exercise is not a problem, but yoga where people will sort of pray to the gods related to yoga is a problem. Because it's not then for use as an exercise, it's used for a way to gain power. So in any ritual that's used to replace God with something else, you're taking a risk. The risk, it isn't that gods are saying, I'm going to zap you. It's you're opening yourself up to another reality that is real. And if you're vulnerable, it can have some serious effect on you. Go ahead.
So, second part to that question, does intent have anything to do with the practice? Say someone is intending to, I guess, use a practice to get closer to spirit or God. Does that have anything to do with rather someone else who does not have that intent when, I guess, participating in that practice?
Sure. The question has to do with intent. You can try to. Wait, what's your name?
Seth.
Seth was asking whether or not intent has any effect or bearing upon if somebody wasn't doing it in any way to offend God, but they were doing it in a fashion to try and be in touch with another reality. Would that make any difference?
Or Christian God?
Christian God.
I think that's very clear in Scripture. He doesn't want anything that's not his. And so communicating through mediums and hypnosis and different things, palm readers, that doesn't belong to him. It's very clear in Scripture that we're not supposed to do that. So if we do that, it means to get closer to him. That's just a trick from Satan. And basically it doesn't actually build a wedge.
So it's more of an artificial means of communication or trying to build a relationship with the Holy Spirit or with God rather than a direct relationship. Is that Am I understanding that correctly?
I think when we're trying to build a relationship with God, we have to go straight to the source. So we have to go to the Holy Spirit. We have to go directly to God. Any other means of going around is just Satan's way of saying, hey, I can get you to God if you do this. I can get you to God if you do this. If you meditate on in Ashtanga and you go to a certain mountain, but that's not scriptural. Our only way is to God. So basically, it's Satan's trick to get you to his side to actually connect and open yourself to a spirit world that you don't want to freely just enter without protection of God.
Yeah, that definitely answers it.
Go ahead.
When you mention occult practices like hand readings and stuff, I want to make sure I frame this carefully. You said sexual abuse was a doorway for a demon. But if a person was constantly seeking healing and they were doing so in a fashion that was meditation and seeking seeking God not through the text necessarily being the Bible, or just seeking them just through because they're searching for healing, they're very vulnerable. I just want to know exactly what an occult practice would mean, not necessarily palm reading or.
I think an occult practice would be where another deity or some other kind of power is replacing God as we understand God, as a supreme being.
Because the person invoking what they might think is God in this fashion could be like a trickster.
It could be.
A good example of that, we had a case where someone went to the gypsies and said, the gypsy said, hey, we can fix that problem for you. And so they said, okay. And so the gypsies come over and things get worse. So they had the intention of trying to get closer to God, but they went to the wrong source. And it just compounded their problems. And so we really need to take our problems to the altar of God. And to the confession and just on our knees, individually with the Lord. And that's the true source. Versus another God, Lord, there's other deities that will step in and say, hey, let me help you with that problem, but it just compounds things over and over.
I want to get everybody, but I at least want to give people a chance, right, to talk to you. This gentleman.
What if, per se, someone believed in a pagan god, and as much as any Catholic man or woman would believe in God himself, would he still be in danger from demons, or would that pagan god protect him from those said demons?
Well, I would say this: it would depend on if the pagan god had any attachments to anything demonic. So, if the rituals themselves had any attachment to anything demonic. I mean, I understand your question. If I pray to my own God, who's different than, say, the Judeo-Christian God, is that going to open me up? I mean, you can chime in if you want, but I would say it would depend on whatever those rituals were. Did they somehow have some bearing on something in the spiritual realm that wasn't of God? I don't want to use words that are gobbledygookish. I mean, your question is, I just think you're opening yourself up. You're opening yourself up to the unknown. Now, I'm not here to say I know God completely, my God completely, because there's a lot of God is mystery. But I think if God goes by different names in a pagan kind of way, I don't know. I guess I would have questions about whatever doorways you could open. You want to chime in?
Yeah, I think we know that there's other gods out there and they have powers, and so you have to decide, what are you comfortable with? But what we find is we've had Hindus, we've had Buddhists, where their people send them to the Catholic Church for help to get rid of these demons. So they've been doing their practice, they believed in it, whatever success they said, but all of a sudden when the demon problem comes in, they don't seem to have the know-how to handle it, and all of a sudden they're off to the Catholic Church. But even as a Protestant, I was a Protestant long time before I became Catholic, even in the Protestant level, there's a lot of Protestant churches will say, okay, when it comes to demons, we're sending you to the Catholic Church, because there's people that just have more awareness to it. We don't know why some are more acceptable, but we know it does happen to people with other gods, just like it happens to people with our gods.
That helps? Okay. So maybe that.
I have two questions. First, I noticed you said that within the Catholic theology, you believe that within the Bible, the books of the Bible, there is some truth. Now, in the book of Job, it makes reference, the first chapter kind of sort of says you can understand that God allowed Satan to take all of Job's possessions and whatnot. So you guys, within your practice of exorcism, believe that God allows for all of these possessions to happen?
Yes. I mean, yes. Usually a demon just doesn't just show up. Either you invite them in, or somebody else has invited them in for you. So it would be very rare for the demonic to just arrive. That doesn't mean that demons aren't around, but usually there's some kind of very often, very, very often, people start fooling around with stuff. And it's not like I don't love God or I don't have a relationship with God, or they aren't even thinking about God. Somebody might have just told them, hey, this is really cool, let's do this and see what happens. And then they get into trouble. So usually there's something that's preceding. It just doesn't happen spontaneously.
And the reason God would allow it is so that He can be glorified in the healing of it. That usually it's a door like Satanism or sacrificing or doing something that's out of the realm of the Christian belief. And so God allows it so it comes to their, oh yeah, this is wrong, I got to stop doing this. And then comes the healing by coming to an exorcist.
Okay, so yeah.
Go ahead. You have another question.
The second, I just was wondering, how does this whole journey of becoming, just going so in depth with exorcism, how has it accepted your faith? Like seeing things like the woman's suicide and stuff like that, or even seeing healings and then delivering people from these demons. How has it affected your faith and your relationship with God?
I think at a certain level, there's a lot of people in the world who don't necessarily believe in a personified, intelligent being we call Satan. And that, people have to decide if they can believe that. But I think everybody, for the most part, can pretty much agrees that there is a power, there is an evil power in the world. And for some it's an inanimate kind of thing, or it's the evil that people might perpetrate by incredibly devious acts or whatever. I think for me, I never doubted there was a Satan. But I never really had seen Satan in the manner in which I experience him now. I think what it's done for me, it just reinforces that there is a great battle that's raging and only getting more intense between God and the forces that are represented satanically, whether they call themselves Satanists or not. I think a lot of people, I said this in an interview recently with Maureen Dowd on the New York Times. I think our country is really struggling to figure out, do we believe in God at all? And I really do think that's the main issue. You look at the presidential election going on now, how very often religion is, coming into play, and whether or not it should. But I think there's a lot of people are really. I think our culture is really trying to figure out, what do we believe. I think for me, it just makes what I do as a priest, I think, that much more crucial. I'm not the Savior. It's Christ who's the exorcist. I say that all the time. It's not me. It's Christ who's the exorcist. We're the vessels. And because of the authority that my bishop has given me, that's why I'm the exorcist. The bishop is the chief exorcist in our tradition. The bishop's the chief exorcist of the diocese, not me. I'm able to do this because I've been mandated by him. You had a question.
Yes, what is the Eucharist?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for bringing that up. The Eucharist is communion.
Oh.
It's our communion. And then it comes from a Greek word meaning thanksgiving. But in the Anglican tradition, the Orthodox tradition, they have communion too. They don't call it Eucharist. The Greeks do. The Orthodox do. The Anglicans would call it communion. We would call it communion, but we would call it Eucharist. So,
Right, I know what communion is. I just
right.
never heard that word.
It's another term. Okay, I'll get you. Go ahead. No. This lady behind you. I'm sorry. Yes, I apologize.
So growing up, like keyboards and phoning for Friday, EDMs, things like that, to go and sing. But it's like, my understanding is that it's all in communication with like spirits, and God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, that's communication with spirit. So why is that a sin when I communicate with Jesus? It's like spirit.
Well, when I heard you say, if you involve yourself with all these other devices, right? Why is that wrong? Because it's idolatry. It's paganism, and you're using means that are outside the realm of God to try and communicate in a reality that we would call for a surrender, a faith, rather than using means to contract oneself in order to connect with other spirits. We would say it's against the first commandment. I just talked to a young guy who I've known since he was in grade school who did that very thing, and he's having huge problems as a result of it. So he went to a medium because he misses his grandfather who's been dead for 5 years. And now he's having all kinds of incredibly bad dreams about it, and he's had other kinds of physical manifestations, and he's supposed to come and see me. So all that stuff is just very dangerous. Let me get this young lady here. Please. Sorry.
Okay, so it says here you performed about 40 exorcisms involving individuals. How many of those individuals have killed fully? How many have sought other means of healing? And how many are in some other category?
Okay. Well, the handout you have says 40 and 5. Since then, and that's only less than a year old. It's been a lot more. Two of the people that I mentioned earlier who grew weary and wanted to stop. Of the other 3 of that group, one is two are at the very end, I think, of our involvement with it. Or I think we're really down to the last, probably the most powerful being. One is pretty free of everything. The other person we just prayed with yesterday, and that's a very violent case. And this other gentleman has been fully free. Now there's another group. I mean, these take time. See, people think you just go and you get one and it's all over. Now, there are times when that can happen, but not too often, because there's usually more. If it is demonic, I mean, it's not the first thing I do. It's the last thing I do. It's after everything else that you tried hasn't freed the person. So these are the cases where there is something demonic and deliverance prayer hasn't been sufficient. Of the other 5 or 6, 3 of them were in another diocese where the bishop asked, the archbishop asked me to come and help. And the other 3 people now that I'm working with, and then Linda's working with, we're just starting.
In Rome, they say the average exorcism takes 9 to 13 years. I've been doing this for 25 years with deliverance and exorcism. I've never been on a case more than a year and a half. We have different processes here in the United States that are a lot faster, and, but it's a new kind of prayer technique.
Does that help? Gentleman here in the hat.
You said that like every book has some truth versus like maybe like some other evangelical believe every word has truth, so they take a very literal interpretation. If only every book has some truth, then how do you know what to believe? And how do you know where you're getting divine interpretation, or you're getting just word out of prophet so-and-so's mouth, or out of Job's mouth, instead of out of God's mouth? How do you know how do you discern anymore?
Well, first of all, in Catholic what we call exegesis, which is sort of the science of interpreting the scriptures. We use archaeology, culture, history, language to understand the context in which the scriptures themselves were written, the history of the author, if there is an author who in fact is real versus anonymous, and then to be able, in a sense, and these guys, over the course, especially the last 100 years, where the scriptures have been much more scientifically looked at in our tradition, there are judgments that are made about, like even, for example, did Jesus say all the words that are attributed to him? Well, in the Gospels, for example, there's what's called the three-source theory. And the three-source theory is the synoptics, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called the synoptics because they had common sources. So one of the common sources for Mark's Gospel, which is the first Gospel and the shortest one, was Peter and the Blessed Mother. In the other Gospels, you have those sources. You have the sources from Mark, and you have what's called the Q source, and then you have another source called the independent sayings of Jesus. So, for example, in the Gospels, they're not all the same. There are some miracles and some stories that are unique to some Gospels, and they were all written at different times over the course of 50 years, and they were written for different communities. So, for example, when you use, like, your example just used a minute ago about Job, Bible scholars would look at, and others in other traditions would do the same, and mainline Christian traditions, there's a lot of things that we agree on. They would look to see, using all the things I just mentioned, the variables, okay, in the context, the history, the culture, the language, and the anthropology, very often. Okay, can we make a determination about what is allegorical, what is symbolic, and what is absolute as it happened? And so there would be a lot of study done, per se, and that's where we, as a church, would say there's truth. Like, for example, we would say the truth of the story of creation is that God is the author. Now, fundamentalists would say it all happened in 7 days. We also have numerology, Jewish numerology, so number 7 means perfection. So you could say that the universe was created perfectly, in perfect order. And it was the free will that God risked when he gave it to us that upset the perfection and created the dynamics that we're now discussing. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I wish I could get everybody, but let me get the guy up here. Sorry.
It's kind of unrelated, Rick.
Sorry.
What's the Catholic Church's take on the Nag Hammadi library?
On the which?
The Nag Hammadi, like the Gospel of Thomas. And,
the apocryphal Gospels. I'm not really, I'll tell you my opinion, but I'm not sure how accurate I am. The books that are in the Bible, we would say we call them the canonical books. There's been a lot of stuff written about the Gospel of Thomas and a few other Gospels that never made it into the canonical. I can't give you a real educated answer. I don't think there's a Gnostic Gospel too.
Yeah, it's
the ones that, like there's the Didache. The Didache is a Greek word meaning the writings. That never made it into the Bible either. The books that made it into the Bible are the ones that the early, what we call the patristic fathers, they would have been in the 200s and 300s, decided were the ones that were used the most. I can't speak about the Gospel of Thomas in terms of if it had anything to do with its legitimacy or anything like that. So I'm not.
It does have a lot of spiritual warfare in it, though. Thomas has a lot of spiritual warfare in it. Have you read it? Have you read it? Yeah, there's a lot of references that we see some of that stuff happening, but not necessarily what's absolute truth.
If you wanted a much better answer than I just gave you, if you called St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park and talk to the rector, Jim McCarney, he could probably refer you to somebody. And that's not a very good answer on my part. That's probably the best answer. But I know that the canonical books were the ones that were most used by the early church. And the patristic writers are the ones that decided which books got to be the Bible. I'm sorry, I want to get you, but I want to get somebody I haven't gotten yet. This gal up here, please.
My question is that when someone commits a sin, is that like ultimate sins, murder, rape, something terrible? Do you believe that that is a demon, or is that their like mental health and something else happening to them? And if so, like, are these acts like just to continue the demon's spread, or is it something that is just like that one person who's like trying to make the world terrible?
I would say that not every capital crime has necessarily a demonic inspiration. I think some do. I think it depends on each situation. And I know that's kind of a political, maybe. I don't think that they all are. But I wouldn't rule them out. We've had people who come to us, and even people who I read about where there's been mayhem that's been performed. I mean, I pray over 2 people who are satanic cult survivors. The satanic cult is criminal. It's secret. The folks in the cult perform crimes against humanity of the kind that are indescribable. They sacrifice human beings. They decide who in the cult is going to, which women in the cult will become pregnant so they can then take the child that is born and sacrifice to Satan. They sacrifice other people who may buck the cult. They perform other kinds of heinous acts in order to keep the cult going. So some are, and even people who wouldn't necessarily be in a cult, but who perform those kinds of heinous crimes. Do I think that some of them possibly could be demonically inspired? I wouldn't rule it out. But I think every situation would be different. Okay? Yes, please.
I suppose this is kind of my question. I'm sure that the basis for this question is purely schematic. But when you could you describe a moment that spirits would release from someone's body? I've heard stories, and I think you mentioned the name of the Sable. I've heard the living fallen. Well, I haven't seen that, but I've heard stories of people seeing demons. Is that something that happens? Is there image that
Well, demons are pure spirits. However, there are people I know who can see demons because they have special gifts. When there's a deliverance, there's usually a climax where all of the manifestations of the movement of the limbs and the eyes and the coughing and all the other violent movement kind of there's a release. There's a release, and then there's a point where it just stops. You never stop. If it's the solemn rite of exorcism, you don't stop praying the prayers because you don't know, and the demon wants to basically convince you that he's gone when he's not. So you continue praying those prayers for a time until it's a judgment call, until you decide, there's no more manifestations, and it appears that the demon is gone.
Have you seen,
It's all right. That's all right. Okay. It's all right. Have I seen those?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't. She can. I don't. I see the manifestations. So, and as I said, some people can see them, most people can't. I'm not able. But I see the manifestation when I see the demon through the eyes. Demons enter the senses. The eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth. So I used to work, and it's in the movie, I worked in the funeral business before I was a priest. I was a licensed embalmer. If you look into the eyes, I'm not suggesting that you have done this, when you look into the eyes of a corpse, a dead body, there's an absence. It's very different when I look into your eyes or you look into my eyes. We say that the eyes are the windows of the soul. Well, that's pretty accurate. You look into the eyes of a corpse, there's an absence that is incredibly profound. When I look into the eyes, not always, but at times, of someone who has a demonic attachment, you can see in the eyes, at times, what appears to be very thick contact lens-like look in the eyes. I'm always looking in the eyes to see if I can see something. And sometimes you can. It's not always, but sometimes. So, yeah, I mean, some things are very dramatic. There's no green pea soup in spinning heads. But there is a lot of drama. And then sometimes there isn't a lot of drama. It depends on the intensity of the demon. Depends how long the demon's been there. It also depends on to what degree that person really wants to be freed, even when they say they do. Yes?
So you said that the majority of people who get possessed have some kind of mental illness. So when you perform an exorcism, like, what exactly is the result, like, of their mental state?
Okay, I think you misheard me.
Yeah.
I said the majority of the people who come to me have issues of mental health, not demonic attachment. But not all. There are people who have mental health coupled with the demonic attachment. And then there are people who don't have who don't have mental health issues. That's why I've got the team. So if the clinical psychologist, psychiatrist diagnoses the person based on their interviews that there is a mental health component, that doesn't mean I say, okay, go away. But it means that my approach to their issue is going to be colored by that. So I didn't say that the majority of people who are demonic have mental health problems.
So what exactly is the state of mind after someone is exorcised? Do they return to a normal state, or do they have issues after? Like, what have you seen in...
Usually after the person has been fully freed, they need to be in therapy for a while. Because sometimes, and please feel free to jump in too, sometimes it's sort of a new reality for them because they've had this demonic attachment for a long time. And all of a sudden now it's not there anymore. And it's like, okay, I'm a new person. There's now, what do I do with the space that's been occupied by this being? And I mean that metaphorically. So usually people need to go into therapy for a time. And they really have to, and I say this, I know you guys got to go. For people who are non-Catholic, I always say, people say, well, how do I protect myself from this? A prayer life, a faith life, a moral life. If you're of a different religion whatsoever, at least some kind of prayer life and a moral life. For a Catholic, I always say a prayer life, a moral life, a sacramental life, and a faith life, because we have the sacraments in our system. But that has to be in place, because if they just simply say, okay, and we've had this happen, people just kind of didn't do anything after they were freed, the demons will come back 7 times. That's in the 12th chapter of Matthew. And I've seen that firsthand, and I'll tell you, it's terrible. So it's not like your life is never the same again. That's not bad. But if you don't yourself have a conversion experience, what you had before will get worse.
And you have to remember, Satan only wants what God has. So the people we're talking about here usually have unusual gifting, some kind of ministry potential for God. So Satan's using that to slow them down because they have such a potential for God.
Go ahead.
So, why do you think the occult is higher level of practice in Europe than America? And likewise, where would you see it? And would you see it more in Europe or in America?
Well, first of all, the occult, I think what's happened in Europe is happening here. Usually what's happened is Europe has become really, really secular. The same thing is happening in the United States, where God is the mention of God or the place of God or the involvement of God is being put in a box and kept in the private sector. And so what's replacing that very often for people, in a sense, is kind of new neo forms of idolatry. So in the satanic cults are very secret. So the only way I would find out about something like that is if someone came to me and told me they were in it. Now, there's the satanic church. That's different than the satanic cult. The satanic church is a legal entity. And they have the same protection that any church has because of the Constitution. A satanic cult is very secret. That's the difference. Or that one is legal and one is not. And one would be far more, I'm not suggesting the satanic church is into criminal stuff, but a satanic cult. Well,
satanic murders. Not like with the like a direct link to satanic cult. They haven't been able to find like any actual links to it.
No, they haven't. Now, I just recently got a flyer because the auxiliary bishop of our diocese lives with me at Sacred Heart. His brother's a police officer, and the FBI was coming out to do kind of a workshop on satanic cults and other kinds of things we're talking about here today. So I wanted to go. Well, when I called to sign up, they said, you can't come. This is only for law enforcement, and the public's not invited. I told them I was. I was an exorcist and stuff. You can't come, and we can't let you come because this is only for law enforcement. And how did you find out about it? I said, well, the bishop's brother is a police officer in San Francisco. He said, well, I'm sorry, you're not invited. So, I think, and I've never per se talked to somebody in law enforcement on a direct basis. I have friends who've told me that they have friends in law enforcement who have seen a lot of things in satanic cults where there's obviously criminal stuff involved. We're at 20 to 4. I probably should stop talking. I hope, was this helpful? Was this good? We just shared with you what our experiences are. We're not here to convince you, but I hope this information was helpful. I'm grateful for your questions.